In 1820, every family living in the southern Appalachian Mountains already knew exactly who they were, where they had come from, and what it cost to survive on those ridges. That knowledge held intact for generations, passing from grandmothers to daughters in smoky kitchens, and from fathers to sons on frost-hard ground, until the middle of the 20th century arrived, and a particular version of American progress quietly reclassified these people as a problem requiring outside intervention. What you are about to hear is not a new discovery. Some of it is 400 years old, and it explains more about the shape of this country than most history books have ever been willing to say out loud. Start with what this costs you right now, and not in money. If you grew up anywhere near Appalachia, or if you have driven through it even once, or if you have watched a politician stand in front of a coal operation and make a solemn promise, you carry a picture of these people that someone else painted for you. Poor, stubborn, isolated, resistant to help, somehow responsible for their own condition. That picture has been so thoroughly distributed, so consistently reinforced through journalism and film and policy papers over so many decades that most Americans hold it without ever stopping to question where it came from or who it served. Here is what that picture leaves out entirely. The people who settled the Appalachian Mountains between roughly 1730 and 1790 were not the desperate refuse of European failure washing up on American shores. They were the survivors of one of the longest and most sustained cycles of conflict in British history, drawn from the Anglo-Scottish borderlands, from the northern English counties of Northumberland, Cumberland, and Westmoreland, and from the lowland Scottish counties of Ayrshire, Roxburghshire, and Dumfriesshire. Before reaching America, many of them had spent a full generation in Ulster, Ireland, compressed between English landlords above them and hostile neighbors around them, learning through hard experience to hold ground with very little margin for error. Approximately 90% of Appalachia's earliest European settlers originated from that specific border country, and that figure carries real weight. 9 in 10 settlers, not a scattered assortment of European immigrants, not a random ethnic mix, but one coherent cultural tradition shaped across 3 centuries of raid, famine, displacement, and survival, transplanted into mountain terrain that must have felt, in its bones, like the landscape they had already learned to endure. That is not the biography of a defeated people. That is the profile of a community that had been tested repeatedly and had not broken. But here's the thing about the mountains they entered. Long before those Scots-Irish settlers arrived, the Southern Highlands already held people who had built something genuinely extraordinary over many generations. The Cherokee controlled the majority of southern Appalachia by the early 18th century, and were not a scattered remnant of some earlier civilization. They operated as an economic force whose trade networks reached the Great Lakes to the north and the Gulf Coast to the south, moving copper, crafted goods, and agricultural products across distances that most European observers at the time could barely imagine. Before the Cherokee, the Hopewell and Mississippian cultures had raised earthwork mounds of a scale that still catches visitors off guard, and had sustained exchange systems connecting communities across thousands of miles of what is now the eastern United States. The mountain valleys were not empty wilderness waiting patiently for European settlement. They were a managed, inhabited, deeply understood landscape with existing rules, existing relationships, and existing knowledge about how those ridges and hollows behaved across every season. The settlers who entered did not step into a void. They entered a contested place, and what happened next in that contested place is the part the standard American narrative almost always gets wrong. When Scots-Irish backcountry families and remnant indigenous communities began living in proximity, and when the African-American population already present in Appalachia by 1860, roughly 1 person in 10, added their own accumulated technical and cultural knowledge to the mix, something genuinely original took shape. Not English, not Cherokee, not African, but something that grew from all 3 traditions pressed together by geography and by the shared pressure of being ignored by the outside world. And buried inside that synthesis is a single specific preserved technique, passed between those communities and held in an almost unbroken line to the present day, that almost nobody outside a small network of traditional Appalachian families still knows in its complete form. That detail is coming. But first, it is worth understanding just how thoroughly the outside world has worked to misread the people who kept it alive. Here is where the story gets uncomfortable. Lyndon Johnson signed the Appalachian Regional Development Act in 1965, and the stated purpose was economic development. The language in the legislation was explicit, describing the region as lagging behind the rest of the nation, with its people not sharing properly in the country's prosperity, and the Appalachian Regional Commission was created specifically to correct what the act characterized as a fixable problem. By 2025, the ARC had invested more than $4.5 billion across 28,000 separate projects, spanning 60 years of sustained effort. The 2025 chart book, drawn from 2019 to 2023 American Community Survey data, places median household income in Appalachia at $64,588, which sits nearly $14,000 below the national average. More than 14% of the region's residents live in poverty, or what the ARC classifies as deep poverty, and only 27% hold a 4-year college degree against a national figure of 35%. Taken in isolation, those numbers look like failure, and the ARC's own publications present them as evidence that continued investment remains necessary. But ask yourself what 60 years of intervention has actually changed about the underlying structure of the problem, because the structure itself has a history that predates the ARC by nearly a century. The coal companies that entered the mountains in the late 19th century did not arrive to build lasting communities. They arrived to extract a resource, and they built rail lines into mountain hollows and company towns along those lines. And when the seams ran thin, or the market shifted elsewhere, they left. The wealth generated by Appalachian coal, Appalachian timber, and Appalachian natural gas did not accumulate in Appalachia. It moved outward to corporate headquarters in cities. The miners who produced it never once visited, and the communities left behind carried both the environmental damage and the economic void simultaneously. The difference is that outside capital arrived and stripped the timber. The difference is that outside capital arrived and extracted the coal beneath families who had lived above it for 5 generations. The difference is that outside capital spent 150 years pulling the material wealth out of the most resource-rich region in the eastern United States, and then constructed a cultural narrative that held the people left behind responsible for their own poverty, which protected the reputations of the people who had actually produced that poverty. Now, if you are thinking this only applies to someone studying history from a comfortable distance, stay with me, because this next part is specifically for you, and it is entirely practical. The Appalachian self-sufficiency tradition did not vanish. It retreated into smaller networks, into specific hollows and specific families, and the practical knowledge it carries is accessible to anyone willing to look past the poverty narrative and into the actual documented record of how these families built, grew, preserved, and maintained life across generations of deliberate neglect by every institution that claimed to be helping them. Fermentation-based food preservation in the Appalachian tradition requires no refrigeration, no commercial canning equipment, and no purchased starter cultures of any kind. The process uses naturally occurring wild lactobacillus cultures present on the surface of locally grown vegetables, and the only physical inputs are a 5-gallon ceramic crock, available at most rural supply stores for between $18 and $35, and the correct salt-to-vegetable ratio. Preserved this way, root vegetables and leafy greens remain nutritionally stable for 3 to 4 months without any power source, and the setup requires a single afternoon of work. No permits, no contractors, no specialized tools beyond what has already been named. Appalachian families also developed food cellars built not to the elaborate specifications of New England root cellars, but as shallow-dig, hillside-banked storage chambers, typically between 4 and 6 feet deep, that use the thermal mass of undisturbed soil to hold a near-constant temperature of 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit through both summer and winter. On a standard residential lot with a slope of 8 degrees or more, a functional version of this structure can be built over a long weekend using a rental auger at roughly $80 a day and standard treated lumber for framing, with no other equipment required. These are not heritage crafts preserved for hobbyists with rural fantasy projects. These are working systems that families in eastern Kentucky, western North Carolina, and the hill counties of Tennessee still use as primary food security infrastructure, not as gestures toward an imagined past, but as genuine practical tools that cost almost nothing to maintain. That knowledge survives because a community held it through 100 years of being told by outside observers that they were too poor and too uneducated to know anything worth preserving. There is more to this story, and here is something else most people have never been told. The banjo, which became the defining instrument of Appalachian music, and through it the animating sound of American folk and country music across the 20th century, did not originate in the British Isles. Its ancestry is African, carried to Appalachia by African-American musicians, and absorbed into Scots-Irish musical traditions through direct cultural contact, producing a hybrid sound that belonged completely to Appalachia, and to no single heritage within it. The Melungeons, a distinct multiracial population documented in early 19th century Appalachia, emerged from the mixing of African, European, and Native American communities in the mountain hollows, and their accumulated knowledge drew from all three parent traditions. As racial categories hardened across the 19th century, that population was systematically excluded from white social structures, and the knowledge they carried was reclassified as poverty culture, which conveniently protected the racial hierarchy and cost everyone who came after them. The Underground Railroad also ran through Appalachia, from Chattanooga north through the mountain ridges to Pennsylvania, and the same terrain that outside observers consistently read as isolating and backward functioned for a significant period of American history as the most reliable freedom corridor in the eastern states. The geography that made Appalachian communities look primitive to outsiders made them functionally invisible to the people those outsiders served, and that invisibility had uses the standard narrative never acknowledges. Now, here is the specific preserved practice that connects all of this, the one detail I found documented in a source that most people have never encountered. The document is the 1899 Fireside Industries Report, compiled by Catherine Pettit and May Stone, the founders of the Hindman Settlement School in Knott County, Kentucky, and published by the settlement school itself. Most of the report covers craft and textile production, which is the section most researchers stop at when they find it in the oral history archives at Berea College. But in the section addressing food and medicine, Pettit and Stone recorded a practice they directly observed in the homes of elderly Cherokee-descended families living in the troublesome creek watershed. And that section is the one almost nobody reads. The practice is the use of wood ash lye water, specifically lye drawn from the combined ash of hickory and white oak rather than either wood used alone, as a treatment for dried vegetables that simultaneously neutralizes naturally occurring anti-nutrients in dried legumes and acts as a mineral supplement, adding calcium and potassium in bioavailable form directly to the food. Pettit noted it plainly in her own words. The families she observed had no access to commercial supplements and no pharmacy within 20 miles of where they lived, yet showed none of the nutritional deficiency conditions common in comparable low-income populations in the urban settlements she had visited before arriving in Knott County. The ingredient that makes the difference is the dual wood-ash combination itself. Hickory ash alone produces a lye solution too caustic for food use at practical concentrations, and white oak ash alone produces a lye too weak to penetrate dried legume skins with any effectiveness. The specific ratio of 2 parts hickory ash to to 3 parts white oak ash by volume produces a solution in precisely the correct pH range for both mineral transfer and anti-nutrient reduction. And that ratio was not written down in any commercial publication because it was never commercially useful to anyone with something to sell. Now, here is the honesty, because this technique has real conditions attached to it, and pretending otherwise would undermine everything else said here. The lye water process requires precision, and if the ash ratio is wrong, or the concentration untested before use, the resulting solution can be too alkaline for safe food contact. The traditional method used a float test, placing a fresh egg in the prepared solution and reading the result. The egg should float with a surface area roughly the size of a quarter visible above the waterline, indicating correct concentration. That test is reliable, but it requires practice to read consistently, and the first 2 or 3 batches should be treated as calibration runs rather than food production. The mainstream food safety position on home lye processing is cautious, and that caution exists for genuine reasons connected to commercial lye products, which vary in purity and behave differently from wood ash leachate. These are chemically distinct materials, and the caution appropriate for one does not translate directly to the other. Pettit's 1899 report acknowledged the precision requirement without softening it. She wrote that the families she observed had learned the float test from their grandmothers, and that those grandmothers had learned it from the Cherokee women who first demonstrated it to them. The knowledge transferred person to person across generations, because the precision it required could only be conveyed through direct demonstration, and that is exactly why it never survived in written commercial form. It was too specific to be sold and too practical to be forgotten by the people who actually needed it. 4 centuries of Appalachian history, taken together, demonstrate something the outside world has spent 150 years working hard not to see. A culture forged in the Anglo-Scottish borderlands, refined under pressure in Ulster, transplanted into American mountain terrain, and forced into genuine contact with indigenous and African knowledge systems, produced something worth far more than the poverty narrative assigned to it. Not because the outside world failed to look carefully enough, but because it was profitable not to see what was actually there. The RC data from 2025 confirms that the number of high-poverty counties in Appalachia fell from 297 in 1960 to 119 by 2023, and that represents genuine measurable progress that deserves acknowledgement. And yet the region's mortality rate from diseases of despair in 2022 stood at 105 deaths per 100,000 people, 37% higher than non-Appalachian areas, with the rate of substance-related loss running 53% above the national figure. Progress in infrastructure, a persistent crisis in human stability, and the gap between those two facts does not close by building more roads. It closes when a community recovers its own understanding of what it knows and what that knowledge is actually worth. The families in Knott County who kept the wood ash practice alive across 4 generations were not rejecting the modern world out of stubbornness or fear. They were refusing to trade something real for something cheaper, and that refusal, repeated quietly in hollow after hollow across the central Appalachian Mountains, is the most honest thing this entire history contains. If you want to go further with what you have just heard, the Berea College Appalachian Sound Archives holds Pettit and Stone's original documentation alongside recorded oral histories from Knott and Letcher County families extending into the 1980s, and access is free through their digital archive. The 1899 Fireside Industries Report is the anchor document, and every practical detail described here traces to sources you can locate and verify yourself in the original language, with the original names attached. If you are the kind of person who believes that real knowledge has been quietly buried to protect someone else's revenue, you already know what to do, and the subscribe button is exactly where you expect it to be. Next week covers traditional Appalachian water sourcing, specifically the gravity-fed spring box system that families in the Blue Ridge maintained without pumps, without filtration chemicals, and without any municipal connection for over 200 years. there is one construction detail in that system found only in a single 1914 Extension Service bulletin from the Virginia Agricultural and Mechanical College, and every modern off-grid water guide leaves it out entirely. That omission is why most attempts at replicating the system fail. Subscribe now so that the video reaches you when it posts. Tell me in the comments where your family came from and what they knew that never got passed down to you. This audience carries knowledge the internet has not cataloged yet, and the comments section is exactly the right place to start changing that.